Gen Z, the generation born roughly between 1997 and 2012. They grew up with smartphones, social media, and a constant stream of information. But behind the memes, the slang, and the short attention spans people love to talk about, there's something much deeper happening in their psychology. And it's not what most people think. A lot of older generations say Gen Z is lazy, distracted, or too sensitive. But psychology suggests something very different. In many ways, Gen Z isn't weaker. They're just reacting to a completely different world, and their brains have adapted to survive it. Let's start with the biggest difference. Gen Z is the first generation to grow up fully inside the internet. Millennials remember a time before social media. Gen X and Boomers grew up without it completely. But Gen Z? For them, the internet wasn't an invention, it was an environment. And growing up in a digital environment changes how your brain develops. Research shows that constant exposure to fast content, notifications, and algorithm-driven feeds trains the brain to expect frequent stimulation. Dopamine spikes happen every time a post gets likes, a message arrives, or a new video starts playing. Over time, the brain starts craving that stimulation. This is why Gen Z is often described as having shorter attention spans. But it's not because they're less intelligent. It's because their brains were trained in a faster, more chaotic environment. Imagine two people learning to drive. One grows up on quiet country roads. The other grows up in a dense, high-speed city with constant traffic and noise. Who do you think will develop different driving habits? Gen Z's brains are like that second driver. They've been trained in high-speed mental traffic since childhood. But that environment didn't just affect attention. It also affected identity. Previous generations mostly compared themselves to people in their immediate surroundings, classmates, neighbors, co-workers. Gen Z compares themselves to the entire world. At any moment, they can open an app and see someone richer, more attractive, more successful, or more talented than them. And not just one person, thousands. Psychologists call this upward social comparison, and it has a powerful effect on self-esteem. When you constantly compare your everyday life to someone else's highlight reel, you start to feel like you're falling behind, even if you're doing perfectly fine. This is one of the main reasons Gen Z reports higher levels of anxiety and depression compared to previous generations. But there's another factor people often ignore. Gen Z didn't just grow up online. They grew up during instability. Many of them watched their families struggle during economic recessions. They've lived through global pandemics. They've grown up hearing constant news about climate change, political conflict, and economic uncertainty. Their world has always felt unpredictable. And when a brain grows up in an unpredictable environment, it becomes more sensitive to threats, more alert, more cautious. This isn't weakness, it's adaptation. In psychology, this is known as threat sensitivity. When your environment feels unstable, your brain becomes better at detecting danger. But the trade-off is higher anxiety. So what older generations call overly sensitive is often just a nervous system that was trained in a more stressful environment. But here's where things get interesting. Despite higher anxiety levels, Gen Z is also more open-minded than any previous generation. They're more accepting of different identities, cultures, and lifestyles. They talk more openly about mental health. They're more willing to question authority and challenge old systems. Why? Because the internet exposed them to thousands of perspectives at a very young age. Instead of growing up in one culture, one ideology, or one way of thinking, Gen Z grew up surrounded by constant diversity of thought. When your brain is exposed to many different viewpoints, it becomes more flexible, more tolerant, more curious. Psychologists call this cognitive openness, and Gen Z scores higher on it than most previous generations. But this openness also comes with a downside. Too many choices can create decision paralysis. In the past, life paths were more predictable. You finished school, you got a job, you stayed in that job for years. You followed a clear script. Gen Z doesn't have that script. They see people making money online, switching careers, traveling the world, building personal brands, starting businesses, and rejecting traditional lifestyles. It sounds freeing, but it can also be overwhelming. When there are too many possible paths, the brain struggles to choose one, and that uncertainty can lead to stress and indecision. Another major psychological trait of Gen Z is their relationship with authenticity. Older generations were more comfortable with formal roles. Bosses acted like bosses. Teachers acted like teachers. Companies spoke in corporate language. Gen Z is different. They have a strong aversion to anything that feels fake, forced, or overly polished. They grew up watching influencers, behind-the-scenes content, and real-life moments online. So they developed a strong radar for inauthentic behavior. If something feels scripted, corporate, or dishonest, they lose interest fast. This is why traditional advertising often fails with Gen Z. They don't want perfection, they want honesty. They'd rather follow someone relatable than someone flawless. But perhaps the most defining psychological trait of Gen Z is their focus on mental well-being. Previous generations were taught to push through stress, ignore emotions, and just keep working. Mental health was rarely discussed. Gen Z grew up in a culture where therapy, anxiety, burnout, and emotional health are openly talked about. So instead of ignoring their mental state, they pay attention to it. They set boundaries. They leave toxic environments. They prioritize work-life balance. To some older generations, this looks like weakness or lack of discipline. But from a psychological perspective, it may actually be a more sustainable approach to life. Because chronic stress and burnout have long-term consequences. Gen Z is simply less willing to sacrifice their mental health for systems they don't trust. But there's one more psychological pattern that defines Gen Z. It's called the fear of missing out, or FOMO. Previous generations had limited awareness of what others were doing. If your friends went to a party and you stayed home, you might never even hear about it. Gen Z doesn't have that luxury. At any moment, they can open their phone and see hundreds of people living exciting, productive, or glamorous lives. Someone is traveling. Someone is making money online. Someone is at a concert. Someone just got promoted. Someone is in a perfect relationship. And their brain processes all of it as comparison data. Psychologists say the human brain isn't built to track the lives of thousands of people at once. It evolved to compare itself to a small social circle. When that circle suddenly becomes the entire internet, the brain starts to feel like it's constantly falling behind, even when nothing is actually wrong. This creates a quiet but persistent anxiety, the feeling that you should be doing more, earning more, experiencing more, becoming more. And that pressure doesn't come from parents or teachers, it comes from the feed in your pocket. For many Gen Z individuals, life doesn't feel like a straight path anymore. It feels like a race where the finish line keeps moving, and that constant comparison is mentally exhausting. So what does all of this mean? Gen Z isn't lazy. They grew up in a high-stimulation digital world. They're not overly sensitive. They developed in an environment full of uncertainty. They're not entitled. They just see more options than any generation before them. Their brains are wired differently because their environment was different. And that difference is shaping the future in ways we're only beginning to understand. If you're part of Gen Z, you're not broken. You're not behind, and you're not too much. You're just part of the first generation that grew up in a world that never slowed down. And your psychology reflects that reality.